I have dealt with it, and we will now always defend the rights of victims.
If his staff had really kept a secret from him of this enormity, he would have fired them a long time ago. But he hasn't, because he knows, and they know, that he knew way back then.
I invite the leader of the Conservative Party to repeat that allegation outside of the House. I will absolutely reject it.
And because he has misled this House, will the Prime Minister fire him?
Yeah.
What did they get with Conservatives, Mr. Speaker, the last time they were in government? Cuts to the Correctional Services of Canada in the amount of $300 million in their last year of government.
Public Safety Minister Marco Mendicino there is refusing the opposition's calls for his resignation. The minister's staff knew, according to CBC First, about the pending transfer of notorious serial killer and rapist Paul Bernardo to a medium security prison months before the minister found out. Let's bring in the front bench panel to unpack what's happened and what might happen next. With us this evening, Sabrina Grover was a federal Liberal candidate in the 2021 election. She's now a principal at Shakti Strategies. Former Alberta PC MLA and Cabinet Minister Gary Maher is here. He's the president and CEO of the Canada West Foundation. Former Ontario NDP MPP Guratin Singh is with us. He's now vice president at Crestview Strategy. He's also the brother of federal NDP leader Jagmeet Singh. And the Globe and Mail's senior political reporter Marika Walsh rounds us out. Hi, everybody. Good to see you tonight. Marika, I'll start with you because you've been up on the Hill all day chasing down all these politicians. I mean, the crux of what happened is that, as I said, CBC First reported, we confirmed the minister's office knew about this transfer, and the families never found out until after it occurred.
And the minister says he never found out, which is, you know, when he told reporters a few weeks ago that he was shocked by the news that Paul Bernardo was transferred, well, now we know he shouldn't have been shocked. And so it's yet another example of a breakdown in communications in this federal cabinet that leads to critical pieces of information on the most contentious files apparently not getting up to the people responsible for them. You saw in the House the Conservatives responding with incredulity, but the NDP and the Bloc Québécois also are very skeptical about the whole matter and say it raises questions about the Prime Minister's competence because it goes beyond Mr. Mendicino, they say. I think one of the clips that you played off the top was so on the nose, and I don't think it was intentional from the minister when he said, we will now put victims first in this process. That word now is something that shouldn't need to be there, and the fact that it is speaks to how big the problem is.
Well, his response today, Guratin, was to issue a new directive, a new ministerial directive that would see information like this get to him. I think most Canadians would assume that that would have already been the case, which kind of lends itself to, I think, some of the ammunition the opposition have today.
I agree with the analysis that was just presented for completely. It's really shocking that we have this huge breakdown in communication. It does really bode really poorly for the Liberal government right now when they see just, it seems like just blunder after blunder, mistake after mistake, mishandling after mishandling of really important and really crucial files, be it the one that's before us, be it foreign interference, be it issues around immigration. It's continually showing that this is beyond just a minister. This is about the entire Liberal government and their inability to manage really sensitive and important matters, and I think that's a problem.
I think the tough part here also, Sabrina, is this is one of those cases. I mean, this individual, Paul Bernardo, I don't know if there is a more notorious, I keep using the word notorious, but it is so applicable here, right? Like, there is nobody in this country who isn't aware of the completely horrifying nature of his crimes. And I think most people assumed he would be behind bars forever. And so just the fact that this is all going down in the first place, that he was transferred, that's enough to kind of fuel a discussion and debate. But to have the sense maybe that the minister isn't as aware as he could have been. You know, it deflates a lot of the reaction, for example, that he had initially, which I think did hit hit on the nose of what things were. When he was saying, I'm shocked and I understand that you're outraged, like, he had a good initial response, but that seems to have been deflated a lot by this news.
You know, I think it is an emotionally charged issue, and I share, you know, anguish and concern, like all Canadians do, about what's transpired by Correctional Services Canada. But I think there's really, I think it would be hard to not believe the minister when he says he didn't know. And whether or not his staff knew, I think that's a very different situation. I think there's clearly a breakdown in communications, and that is disappointing on the staff side. And I think the minister will take steps to address that. It seems like he already has. But I think that the minister has taken this seriously, and in his ability to put victims' rights at the center of this and move that process forward, he seems to have taken those steps immediately, and has put that directive out to correctional services. Mm-hmm. One of the things, though, I think is really important here, and when we're talking about the context of which the Conservatives are asking for the resignation, whether or not the minister knew 2 months ago, whether or not the minister knew the day of, that is yet to be determined. But what is it that Mr. Poilievre thinks that the minister would have been able to do? I think there's clearly a larger gap in the way that we address this issue, whether it's a high-profile victim or a high-profile case or a maximum security case. But the minister doesn't have the ability to intervene on a case-by-case basis on inmate transfers, and the opposition knows this. And Mendicino made that clear in question period today. And so I think, for Mr. Poilievre to be calling on his resignation, we really have to ask, what is it that he thinks could have been done differently from the minister's side personally? I think there's clearly, issues to be resolved on staff. There's clearly issues to be resolved between CSC and the communications to the department and to the ministry. But there isn't really anything to say that the minister could have intervened on this case earlier.
I think that's a valid point. I think from a sort of communications perspective, though, Gary, the idea that people in his office knew and that he came out and said, I'm as shocked as everybody else, it's the sort of juxtaposition of those two things, right? Both can be true, certainly, but it doesn't sound good to people who are almost uniformly horrified that this individual has been transferred.
I think it's clearly been demonstrated that there is a lack of communication, that there's a communications breakdown within the minister's office. I think it's a valid question to ask, what could Minister Mendicino have done? It's hard to be a minister, is the fact. You get trouble if you exercise your discretion. Say if you're the Attorney General and being asked to exercise your discretion on SNC-Lavalin, but you're also in trouble if you don't exercise your discretion, which, and I don't know what discretion Minister Mendicino had with respect to the transfer of Mr. Bernardo. It is a politically charged circumstance. And the question then arises as to when is it appropriate to be calling for the resignation of a minister? I can remember when Art Eggleton resigned because he had given a contract to a close friend of his. That sort of thing seems to happen today. Ministers don't resign over that today. So one wonders, when is it appropriate for a minister to resign? When is it appropriate to call for a resignation? I think that's also a legitimate question.
I think they're very legitimate questions, Marika. And I think if we're being honest, there's a ton of talk right now in Ottawa about what might happen to Minister Mendicino. And much of that is driven by the Prime Minister's own answers today, which did not jump immediately to the minister's defense or, present a voracious defense of the minister's position. It was kind of like, oh, he'll respond to that later. And I think that there has been a sense, for example, on the foreign interference file, which Minister Mendicino and Minister LeBlanc were at the forefront of, that now it's Minister LeBlanc who's very much the key person on that file.
I think that's absolutely correct. I think if I was Minister Mendicino or somebody in his office, and for the second time in the last 2 weeks, the Prime Minister almost dropped him, right? The last time the Prime Minister was asked about Paul Bernardo's transfer, he said essentially, the minister will speak to that. And he said something very similar today, and that is not the kind of response you want to see as a minister in a cabinet when there's so many rumors all over Ottawa about a cabinet shuffle this summer. So I think certainly it would not leave me feeling very comfortable in my position. And I think Mr. Mendicino has broader issues because it's not just this. It's been a rocky year for quite some time for him, including with the gun files that was mishandled. They totally had to walk away from their changes. They invoked the ire of one of their closest advocacy groups on gun control. So it's been a really rough year for the minister, and it's not getting easier. And I think, the fact that today it's the second time in a month that he is issuing a directive to an agency that reports to him telling them to talk to him. So, you know, when that is what you're resorting to because you are, again, in a mess, I think that just speaks to the challenges he's facing.
Garajan, I'm not the arbiter of who should resign and who shouldn't, but I think, you know, Marika pointed to two examples of the Prime Minister's comments. To me, the more consequential one is today, because the question of resignation was before him, right? The Tories early in the day had said that the minister should resign as a consequence of this. I read something into, I don't know exactly, but I read something into the fact the Prime Minister did not say immediately, there's no way my minister should resign.
I think we all are saying and articulating what we all probably sense right now. The way you describe the fact that there is not a very clear defense of the minister coming from the Prime Minister, the fact that this is one of many mishandling files that have happened recently, you know, I don't think it bodes well in that regard, but, you know, time will tell what happens.
Sabrina, do you think that there will ultimately be a resignation or a cabinet shuffle, or do you think the calls go too far?
You know, I'm just as much in the Ottawa bubble as anybody else, and I've heard the same rumors of cabinet shuffles. I think it really depends on how the government hopes to execute the rest of its mandate and commit to some of the things that they've, you know, outlined that they want to achieve in the next couple of months. So whether or not Mr. Mendicino stays in this role or moves to something else, I think it'll really come down to whether or not how the government is going to be able to achieve its goals and who is in the right position to achieve those outcomes from a ministry perspective.
Gary, last word to you on this.
Well, you know, Ottawa is a bubble, as Sabrina's correctly pointed out, and there's lots of speculation about cabinet shuffles. It will be difficult to see how the minister finds his way out of the circumstances that he's found himself in, some of which has been self-inflicted and some of which has been outside of his control. But it does speak to the whole issue of ministerial discretion. What discretion did he have to make a change? It's always difficult. To be a minister in the federal crown or any level of government is very challenging. He is in a tight bind and may find relief. And perhaps the easiest thing for the Prime Minister is to have a cabinet shuffle.